Let me show you how I created this professional looking advertisement, step by step. This video will be a bit detailed, but make sure to stick till the end. I'm sure you'll learn something really valuable from this. What I will show you in this video is how to create a professional backdrop, how to composite and manipulate different images, how to add realistic lighting and shadows, and making the product pop without losing too much realism. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it. So here I wanted to create a studio backdrop, and I just make a simple gradient. Let's use something like this and a darker blue. So imagine the light coming from the top right. And then we make another gradient, this time vertically, from up to bottom, and we can use the same colors. Something like this. And then lower the opacity a bit. So now let's click on the mask and then drag out another gradient, in the mask this time, from black to white, so that the left side is hidden, like this. And now it looks like the light coming from the right side. And then we have to make it a bit more realistic, because now it looks too clean. So for that, I make a gray layer, a 50% gray layer. And then we go to filters and then to blur. Not blur, to add noise, like this. And we can convert it to a smart object or rasterize, doesn't really matter. And then let's give it a bit of noise, something like this. Alright, so we can go to filter and then to blur, and then click on blur more, one time, something like this. And then we set it to overlay. This is before, this is after. But still the gradient looks too strong. So let's go to levels, let's click Command L, and then drag the midtones to the left. And then lower the opacity, and we have a bit more organic noise like that. So let's drop in our soft drink. If you look at this, it looks nice, but if we zoom in a bit, then we can see something. The droplets are not really transparent, like you can see here. So what can we do about this? What we can do is make a selection of the can. And I made the selection already here. You can take your time with it. And then we have the droplets isolated and the can. So let me put the droplets on the front that you can see it. And let's put it on screen. And then we can press Command U and we can lower the saturation. So now it's desaturated. So before and after. But let's move the droplets under the can. And now we can press Command L. And then take the darks up a bit. And the midtones up a bit. Something like this. Let's see, before, after, and now the droplets are transparent. It seems like a little thing, but it adds so much more realism. So for the next step, we can add some oranges. And you can also select some oranges, maybe some slices, some round ones. And I speed up this part and you can see me arrange these objects. So now that we have arranged the overall composition, the first thing what we can do, guys, all the time is adjusting the values at first. So let's go to curves and then adjust the values, the light values and the dark values. So we can brighten the mids a bit and then lower the darks a bit, like to give the can a bit more contrast, so it pops a bit more. What we can do here to add a bit more realism, the background is blue. And realistically, the objects should have a bit of a bluish tint. So what we can do here is go to the blue channel and we can add a slight bluish tone. Something like this. Not too much. And this small tweak adds so much more realism. And if you noticed, the can is not quite sharp. So what we can do here is we can go to filters and then to sharpen, and then sharpen more one time. Look at before and after. It's so much better. And I don't know if you noticed, but the opener thing here on the can is a bit more sharper than the rest. So what we can do here is just blur it a bit. You can go to blur and then blur one time. And now it looks more blended. And next we can add the shadows. Let's start with the oranges. And just pick a color, a darker color. Let's pick this blue. And then invert the mask. And then we can lower the flow of the brush. And then we can paint in our shadows with the soft brush. Remember, the light is coming from the right side, so let's roughly match the shadows accordingly. Okay, something like this. And then let's copy the shadow layer for the other oranges. And then we can paint it again. And then we can set it to multiply. And lower the opacity, like this. Alright. But we have to also kind of paint in the context shadows. So let's do that. Let's copy this layer, the multiply shadow layer, empty the mask, and then let's paint in the context shadows. The context shadows are basically where the objects touch the ground. Like right where the objects touch the ground. So they should be a bit more obvious and a bit more dark. And then another cast shadow here for the can. Remember, the light is coming from the right side, so our shadows should match accordingly. What do we need next? Next we need the shadow on the objects itself, so let's paint them in. Something like this. They would be darker where they don't face the light. And here because the can blocks the light a bit. Something like this, guys. So obviously, next we need a bit of light on the oranges. So let's paint them in. Just a bit. Just a touch. So let's bring in our water splashes. Set it to screen. And then warp it a bit around the can. Then we can go to levels again with Command L and then just make it a bit more transparent. Something like this. Okay. And let's mask this part out that we don't need. So again, let's set it to screen. And then make it a bit more transparent with levels again. Then this time on this side. Let's just warp this a bit and then we can mask it out again. So then I had this image here and we can mask the top side that we don't need. And then let's warp it just a bit. Then maybe we can try this image here. Maybe let's desaturate it with Command U and we can set it to screen again. Maybe we can make it a bit more transparent. Let's take the midtones up and then transform. Maybe something like this. Let's mask it out. And then we need a bit more splashes. So let's set it on screen again. It's basically the same, guys. Let's mask these parts out because we don't need that much. Maybe something like this. And then maybe we can just swap this. We set it on screen again. And then let's see what looks good. Something like this looks pretty decent, I'd say. And then we can just copy it and maybe something like this on this side. And of course, we need some droplets and we can set it on screen again. And this time, let's make our oranges a bit wet. It would make sense, right? The oranges wouldn't be like completely dry. They would be a bit wet. And then we can take the brightness down because it's a bit too strong. Maybe something like this. And then let's mask some parts out. That looks much better. And I will do the same for the other oranges. Let me just skip this part because I don't want to bore you to death. Now for the last water overlay, we can just add a bit more splashes in general. So let me mask it again and set it on screen. And then we can reveal some splashes here and there. This top side looked a bit too empty, so I dropped in another slice. Then maybe we can pull it here. Let's warp it a bit. Something like this. And then we have to put it behind the can. Now we have a problem here. The orange looks a bit dirty, I guess, but we can just use the clone stamp. Something like this. That's better. Now, to kind of elevate the composition a bit, we can make another layer behind the can and then just tap with the soft round brush on a low flow a few times. And then we have a kind of halo effect around the can. Then you can just lower the opacity a bit. So that looks already great. But something is missing, and it's the reflection on the water. So let's copy the can, like pull it a bit down. And then we can convert it to a smart object. And then warp. You can choose arc from the dropdown, and then you can just take this down a bit. So now we need some steps to make it look like a reflection. So we can go to filter, and first we can go to distort, and then wave. And then I found these adjustments worked pretty well, and you can just copy it if you want. And then press OK, and something like this looks a bit more wavy. Next, what we can do is, let me show you. We can go to filter again, and then to radial blur. And let's set it to 5. But we are not finished. We can go to blur again, and then motion blur, and set it to something like 30. Okay, that looks already much better. And then let's make a mask, and let's choose a gradient from black to white. And then we can just fade it a bit. That looks much more real. And now let's set it to lighten. Now we are almost finished. So for the final touches, what we can do is blur some elements a bit. We can go to the orange and then give it a bit more motion blur. That just adds a bit more dynamism. So let's copy the layer and then blur it a bit. Something like this. Let's put it above the other layer. And then we can mask it out in some places. And then we can invert the layer, then reveal it on the edges a bit. Pretty great. Now we are almost finished. So for the leaves, they look a bit static here. Let's give them also a bit of blur, some motion blur, something like this. Then for this one, and this one. And now let's merge all the layers. Then we can go to camera raw. Let's see. We can maybe bring down our highlights a bit. Let's see what looks good. Let's maybe bring down the whites a bit. Give it a bit of temperature, just a bit of yellow maybe, and then just a bit of saturation. Then I mean we can always add some texture and clarity. And then let's give it just a bit of vignette. And just a bit of grain. So let's see how this looks. I'm just trying things out. Let's maybe add some reds. And then we can sharpen it a bit. That always kind of helps. And then we can blur the edges a bit. That needs to be corrected. And then let's just blur the edges, this leaf. And maybe blur it here. And maybe blur it here, maybe here. Alright, let's jump to the reveal. And that's the finished advertisement. I also made a slightly different version here. I don't know what I like more, to be honest. If you watched till here, thank you so much. And I guess I see you in the next one.